Well, we finally made it. We've been doing our deep dives and we've worked our way through the 0 World Series teams and then the 1 World Series winning teams. And now we're on the 2 World Series winning teams. And today we got to do, I guess, what's a special episode for us because we got to talk about our Mets.
Yeah. And, trying to take a step back for a second, I thought, okay, so they have 61 seasons and they have made the playoffs 10 times. That's not good.
And just so we're clear here, normally in these we try to be very impartial. We try to not talk about this. That's going out the window.
Right.
This is two unabashed Met fans talking about the history of the Mets here.
And we're what I consider good Met fans. But you can go with other people who are, I'm sure any franchise, crazy Met fans.
Oh yeah.
I remember going to a game with a bunch of guys who started saying, "Okay, let's name every number 3 in New York Mets history," and went through. And so they're talking about 60 years. These dudes can do it.
I'm not that good.
That's crazy.
I'd be glad if I could do number 5. David Wright wore 5.
Yeah,
31. Piazza wore that. That's about it.
Ed Charles wore number 5. I remember the glider back in.
It gets way harder after that.
So the team is we'll talk about this year because for a second because I, in my infinite wisdom, picked the Mets to win the World Series this year.
Now. Not looking great so far.
Three days ago, I was looking really bad. Now I'm just looking bad.
Right. But just take it into account that at this time last year, the Phillies were under 500.
Right.
This time the year before, the Braves team was under 500.
And before that was the Nationals.
So all you can think about this is basically the Mets are going to the World Series, and hopefully they beat the Astros.
This is the formula. You really suck early, and then you surprise the hell out of everybody.
You play great the rest of the way.
We can only hope. But
the kids are up. We're seeing a bunch of new baby Mets really kind of taking on for the first time. They have 3 rookies really in the starting lineup right now, and there could be a 4th joining them soon.
Yeah, I'm not sure that's going to happen, actually. I'm not as sure as some people. So, and in their history, the Mets have played, actually in 2 years, they're going to play their 10,000th game. What does that mean? It doesn't really mean anything. The Yankees have played almost 18,600.
Right. So think about the Yankees have an extra 40-something years of history. That adds up to almost 10,000 games.
And I think it's the Cubs who actually started as the Chicago White Stockings have the most games played as a franchise, 21,000 games. So you can see just being around for a long time. But the Mets have lost more games in their franchise history than they've won.
Surprising no one, considering how bad those initial teams. That's a hole you got to spend a long time digging yourself out of from those early years.
Yeah, and that's funny you say that because they're like 300 games under 500 in there, so they're not going to make it up in 2 years.
Right, exactly. Those first 5 years, I mean, they still hold the record for the worst overall regular season record for their.
But the Oakland A's are trying.
They're coming.
The Oakland A's
strong
this season are trying. They've got the Mets right now, the 62 Mets. But yeah, they lost 100 games 5 out of the first 6 years at the franchise. Oddly enough, they've only lost 6 times, so they only lost one more time since 1968, 100 games. So that's
right. They've been generally decent since that early. It's just interesting how they've kind of been on a cycle of good and bad throughout their history. They're either really bad for a number of years or they're good. Now, granted, I think most baseball teams are probably something similar to that. It's more the frequency that happens with the Mets that's unusual.
I think, you knew it as a fan, like, oh, yeah, we're going to be bad. We're going to be bad for a few years when it goes south. But I think I didn't realize when you go through the Mets and you have the early Mets, as you said, were bad. And then they won the World Series. They were good, except for 1974. Went to the World Series again in 73. They were bad from 77 to 83. That includes when they traded Seaver and all that stuff. In 84 to 1990, obviously that's through the 1986 Mets and whatnot. They were very good. And then right away after that, in 91, they were bad for another 6 years until 1996. And they were good. It's just like back and forth and back and forth. And it's consistent. It's not like they go bad, good, bad, good. And that kind of makes sense.
You're not going like bad, long stretch of bad, long stretch of good. It's just, about 6 years of good, 6 years of bad, alternating.
So, and when you have a franchise that plays in the same town with a team that's won 27 World Series, and you've got 2 World Series victories, it's hard.
I think the best thing for the Mets is that the Yankees haven't gotten one in a while.
Yeah, but they're in a while is a lot sooner than the Mets.
It's a lot sooner than that. It's just made it more tolerable for the average Met fan, I imagine.
Yeah, I think the rivalry between the two teams is real, but not as hot as it is when they would play in the World Series against each other, or when both teams were good, which doesn't necessarily happen all that often, where they get to the league championship series and you can foresee, another Subway Series.
Yeah, we haven't even had a sniff at one in a long time.
So, 5 pennants in the 10 times they made the playoffs. That's pretty good, that they got there half the time. But I think that, they're better. The fans sort of, think them as the team that, the little team that could a lot of the times, because of their being in the same town as the Yankees and because they only have the 2 World Series. So being a Met fan comes with a lot of pain.
Right. There's a lot of pain. I think so. What's the best thing about being a Met fan? Somebody said it builds character.
Yeah, well, we got a lot of characters as Met fans, and we've got an owner who's a bit of a character right now.
And I think that is kind of interesting because for so long the Mets were seen as the plucky kind of little team that could. And then Steve Cohen bought them, and they are no longer the plucky little team that could.
Well, that's interesting that you say that. You're right, because they were born, obviously, when the Giants and the Dodgers went to the West Coast, and so they start this team. We need a new team, and they've got the owner, Joan Payson, a woman, owned the team, for the beginning of the thing, and that was a little unusual at the time, not unprecedented. And Bill Shea comes in, he's going to build this stadium in Queens and all that, and the early Mets are, as you say, terrible, and they have guys like Marv Throneberry on the team and all that. Marvelous Marv, who was just this crazy dude, and made it to the major leagues and the Mets, and played for them for a couple of years. And you basically are trying to rebuild National League Baseball in New York while the Yankees are winning World Series.
Right.
Yeah, they won in '62. The Yankees, were in the World Series in '63 and
the Mets were probably seen as more of like an amusing sideshow of anything.
It was, and losing 100 games every year, and so I think the first manager was the Yankees World Series manager, Casey Stengel, but I think he was like 74 years old when he took the Mets over. And so he would have all these, sayings and stuff like that Casey, said, what do you think of your team's execution? I'm all for it. That's how bad they were.
Was he also one with the line about hitting the cutoff guy?
No, that was Billy Martin and Winfield. So, but Stengel goes, can anybody here play this game? One guy was, he's 20 years old, and if everything goes well for him, he'll have a chance to be 30 in 10 years. So
that's rough.
Yeah. So they were bad, and so Stengel finally.
So how much did then that 69 miracle that was a complete?
It was out of nowhere.
No one could.
It was out of nowhere.
Like that's why it's the miracle Mets, because they were a 100-loss team, bottom of the division, going into that season. Did anyone even expect them to be passable?
I don't think they were probably finished to pick any more than at the time there were 10 teams in the league, anything more than like 9th.
Right, exactly. Then they win the World Series.
Right. They didn't just, and they were behind, and they had the pitching, so you knew going into the season because Kuzmin, so you had Seaver win the Rookie of the Year in '67, I think, or '66, and Kuzmin won it in '60, finished second the next year to Johnny Bench.
So you're thinking, okay,
we got these 2 really good young pitchers
that could do something, and then it did something.
And they had a guy named Nolan Ryan on that team and Gary Gentry, so you knew the pitching was good. The hitting wasn't great. That whole season, the hitting was like, well, they would just get the hits when they needed. It was just one of those years where guys that just weren't the greatest baseball players had their greatest baseball season.
That must have been so cool.
And it was just, it was just, you couldn't believe it. It's like, that's how they became the Amazin Mets. That was it. Because they were not amazing before that. Oh, Casey called them amazing when they were terrible.
Part of the thing was like, you just couldn't believe they kept winning.
Right. They kept winning, and they won 100 games. So
something they've only done 5 times in their history.
Four times.
Last year was one of them.
It was the 4th time. So yeah, and you were just so surprised, and then they get in the playoffs, and that was the first year of divisional play. So before that, you win the league, you go to the World Series.
Now you have to play an extra round of playoffs.
You had to beat the Atlanta Braves, which the Mets did, which I told you about when I went on the field. And after this, because you can get on the field in those days. I was like 9, and I run out to second base, and 2 guys pick me up and throw me into the outfield. I didn't get the base. I got some grass,
you got to be on the field, though.
That I put in a plastic bag, and for 2 weeks, and then it was all brown. I'm thinking, I don't know why I did that. So.
But I haven't.
And so then they entered the World Series, and after losing Game 1, which Seaver pitched in the 69. They win 4 straight and win the World Series with Davey Johnson, future Met manager, hitting the last out of the World Series in Game 5 to Cleon Jones. Cleon Jones on one knee. So that was such an amazing season. And to get back to the World Series in 1973 when they only won 82 games, so the Mets were like in last place most of that season and came from out of nowhere to beat a bunch of bad teams pretty much to get to the playoffs, and then they won their playoff series against the Reds. Surprisingly enough, the future Big Red Machine,
the sort of Mets sparking that,
and that was the whole series with Bud Harrelson and Pete Rose running into him, and they're getting him in a fight and stuff like that.
And then they go to play the A's in the World
Series. And then they played the A's and they lost in 7 games in that World Series. So that was sort of the end of that group of Mets.
And then they were not very good.
And they were not very good for a while. And then they had kinds of slogans on the outside of the stadium. Catch the rising stars. They lost like 93 games. There's no rising stars.
Or like falling stars at that point.
And they just didn't have good players. And after the whole Seaver thing happened all the way in 77, they were particularly bad, for like 5 or 6 years.
Right, and I think for non-Met fans, it's probably hard to explain how devastating the Seaver trade was to the fan base.
By the way, in 77, they traded Seaver. You know what the Yankees did that year? They won the World Series. Right. You know what they did the next year? They won the World Series.
So to Met fans, they're getting rid of their hero,
right,
the hometown kid that won them the World Series, brought them to another. They trade him, and they don't get particularly much back for him, if I remember.
No, Pat Zachary, was a starting pitcher.
Right. It was not a great trade. And so Met fans are being like, wait, so we just traded Seaver, and we didn't make the playoffs, and the Yankees win the World Series.
And the Mets ownership at the time, and the guy that was running things, Donald Grant, and Seaver just felt disrespected, and he was essentially. I mean, when the guy, when the pitcher is your number 1 WAR player all time, that really says something, and that's what Seaver is for the Mets. He is their number 1 player all time in terms of wins above replacement. So that just tells you how good he was, and he's the unbelievable player. My favorite player, my favorite Met, and I think a lot of guys that are my age would probably feel the same way about Seaver.
If they're a Met fan.
If they're a Met fan, because you just couldn't help. So we took a look and came up with the best Mets at each position. I think it's kind of fun to do that.
Right, and this is where in a lot of these episodes we go through these teams by WAR, but we could just talk about so many more players for the Mets that we can kind of go position by position and debate our ultimate Mets team, more or less.
But you did ask me on the WAR thing who I said who would be the second all time behind Seaver, and I think you were a little surprised that it's David Wright.
Right, I was surprised. I guess it makes sense when you think about it because you have guys like Piazza and Beltran, who would be my normal guesses for number 2, or a guy like Keith or Gary Carter. They didn't spend the majority of their careers with the Mets, whereas Wright spent his entire career with them.
Right, and yet Keith Hernandez has his number retired by the Mets, and he's an all-time exactly. But I think David Wright will get there one day in terms of that.
I'm kind of surprised his number isn't retired
I'm pretty sure it will be, because if you look at the categories, so I looked in Baseball Reference in the categories for all-time stats for the Mets. Like David Wright's name is in like every single stat.
And we've
almost
talked about it. David Wright is a guy that would have been a Hall of Famer had he not gotten injured towards the end.
But for the Mets, and obviously played his whole career, we like that a lot. The most doubles, the most RBIs, the highest batting average, for a regular player like that for playing that long. He just has so many categories where he is the leader in Mets history. I just didn't realize.
And the other thing is,
there's
hits. No other third baseman that's close to him in Mets history.
Oh, in the Mets history, no,
not even one that's even remotely in the same neighborhood.
So, are you familiar with the idea that the Mets had a third base problem for the first 17 years of their franchise history?
See, not as much to me, because by the time I was really aware enough about baseball,
it was a thing.
Following it, they had Ventura.
Oh yeah, no, this is way before.
That's the thing. So to me, the Mets have always actually had pretty good third baseman.
Yeah, no, so they
until recently.
Every year you'd see written about the Mets going, when are they going to find a third baseman? This went from 1962 until they got, I would say, Hubie Brooks came up with the Mets as a rookie. He ended up being traded in the Gary Carter deal. But he was a good rookie third baseman when the Mets started coming around in the early 80s. And then you had Howard Johnson and even Ray Knight and guys like that.
Let's put it this way. This is how I know it's a weak position.
That was a long time to have no third baseman. This is how I know
it's a weak position for the Mets. It's on our rankings here of the third basemen that have played the Mets. Todd Zeile is 4th. That's no shade to Todd Zeile, but that's not a good sign for Mets third baseman.
And Todd Frazier is sixth.
Yeah.
So Hubie Brooks is there, but
Ty Wigginton.
he deserves some credit only because he didn't play that long for the Mets, and so he actually was very good.
Right.
So yeah, that's your third base is always been
There's other
difficult.
positions that are weirdly big strengths for the Mets. You wouldn't think that they would have had like a history of success at those certain positions, but they actually got to have.
Okay.
Well, first base.
Yeah, well, you start with having Keith Hernandez, there, and then Olerud, who I think is we'd say a borderline Hall of Fame candidate.
Well, and Olerud would be a Hall of Fame candidate had he played today, because he would have gotten so much more play.
And you know who else is a Hall of Fame guy who could be talked about is Delgado. Mm-hmm. I mean, he's just one of those almost guys.
You know what? There's a guy playing from the right now.
Yeah.
Pete plays like this for the next 10 seasons. He could be a Hall of Famer.
Now, the guy behind him, just one other guy, Dave Magadan. What do you know about Dave Magadan? Nothing. Okay.
The only thing I know is I think he was a good power hitter.
No. The opposite.
Then he's the opposite. Okay.
So he came up and he was there when Hernandez was not playing anymore. Mm-hmm. Kind of played other positions and all that, but it was primarily a first baseman. Really good hitter. Professional hitter, they would say.
Now, when you put Daniel Murphy as a first baseman for the Mets.
Well, I think he played more there than he did anywhere else for the Mets. Because the first thing he did was play first base until they got Duda, and then they moved him around and had him play second base for a while, which he was not very good at.
They're trying to put him in the outfield. Not very good.
So you're right about first base. I think, and Alonso, look, Pete Alonso's gonna, if they pay him and they keep him, which I expect they will, is gonna have every Met RBI home run record,
power record
by a margin enough, right? Darryl Strawberry is the all-time leader in home runs for the Mets.
Pete's going to bring
252. Yeah. Pete's got about 160 right
Pete's
now.
Gonna shatter
That's
that.
like maybe a couple of seasons.
Right. As long as Pete doesn't leave the Mets, he will hit 400 home runs for them and be their all-time franchise leader by a huge margin.
And I'm sure he hopes to have his name up there near Keith's one day.
I think right now, of all the Mets on the team, he's got the best shot of being that.
But I'd say a weaker position would be second base, and I didn't think of it this way in terms of the all-time Mets to play second base.
Pretty good.
What's that?
It's actually pretty good.
You think it's good list?
Yeah.
I don't know. I mean, if Alfonso is the number one second baseman all time, and he was a very, very good, but there was no way like I'd ever put Edgardo Alfonso in a Hall of Fame kind of a guy.
But most teams, he's no Craig Biggio, but.
No, he's not.
I think when you look at the Mets' history of second baseman, it's actually been we've had a good guy at second base for a lot of their history.
They have competent guys at second base.
That's better than a lot of teams.
Okay, that's trying, and particularly for a middle infield position. So if Backman is your number 2 second baseman all time, and he was really great in '86, obviously.
And Jeff McNeil is 3.
Yeah, which he won't be very long. Although he doesn't play second base, you have to play with who plays everywhere.
A guy like Jeff Kent is on there.
Yeah.
Right, and you have guys that were good second basemen that didn't just play. Like you had Luis Castillo and Roberto Alomar, who were very good second basemen who just didn't play for the Mets.
Even Baerga, before he came to the Mets, was a good second baseman. He put that uniform on
and forgot how to play.
So, the second base is a problem. So here we were, 17 or so minutes into this, and all of a sudden we realized that we hadn't turned on the camera. So you have the audio for the first 17 plus minutes, and we decided we would just forge on. So if you see us now, we've been here the whole time. You just couldn't see us because the camera wasn't on.
Exactly.
But it's on now, so you can see. So we were talking about the team, and we were talking about the infield, and we hadn't done shortstop yet in terms of all-time Mets for shortstop.
Whereas I would say that the second base, actually might have been a little bit of a position of strength for the Mets. I would not say the same about shortstop.
And then you have to say thank goodness for Francisco Lindor, because aside from Jose Reyes,
horrific.
Well, horrific's a little strong, I mean, as a kid, Bud Harrelson was like one of my heroes because he was a little guy that could, and he played shortstop. Couldn't hit a lick for the most part, but was a great defensive player.
By the way, not hitting a lick is going to be a theme for these.
Yeah, any shortstop that played when he did pretty much didn't hit a lick. Let's be honest about that. Even the '86 shortstop Rafael Santana, who's behind Harrelson, couldn't hit a lick. But he could field the ball. Okendo couldn't hit a lick, and he actually did more with the Cardinals than he probably did with the Mets. Kevin Elster, very good. Yeah, Kevin Elster was a sort of a more tooled player in terms of having power. Was probably a better hitter, wasn't a better fielder, but he was very handsome. All the girls liked Kevin Elster, and he had the blue eyes thing, and that was his claim to fame as a Met shortstop. He was really handsome. And then Ray Ordonez, and so I loved Ray Ordonez. He was obviously part of that infield on the '99 team, the best defensive infield of all time. Right? It was.
Ventura, Ordonez, Alfonso,
yeah.
and Olerud.
Right. So I mean, and what a play. His first game, I remember going to the Mets opening day, and he's playing shortstop, and it's cold, because it's always cold opening day, and the Cardinals are up, and the ball ripped down the left field line. Guy coming around second, trying to score at home around third. Ordonez is in left field from his knees, and I remember Howie Rose's call afterward. I heard it because I was at the game, and he takes the ball and he flings it from his knees on one hop and throws the guy out, and was like, whoa, we haven't seen that here in a long, long time.
Who is this?
What the heck is that? And so it's too bad that Ordonez wasn't a better hitter, because he's probably the best fielding shortstop I've ever seen as the Met, and I would include Lindor in that.
Right. If Ordonez could have hit even a little bit, he would have been a multiple-time All-Star.
So
but, he could not.
He could not. Well, and again, that is
not uncommon.
They even have Asdrubal Cabrera on there. It's like an all-time Met or something like that. I don't know where I got this list from, so I think I was putting it together. We did third base. So going to left field, and outfielders move around a lot more even today.
Especially today, you don't have guys that are nearly like
I'm a left fielder.
I'm a left fielder.
So
gotta go where they play you.
And so the number one guy, and we don't ever talk about this. I don't know how much you know about Kevin McReynolds.
I know he played left field for the Mets.
Yeah, he was supposed to be the dude. After the '86 team, they went and got this guy, and they made a move and brought in this, very good player from, I think, San Diego. Mm-hmm. And he was a good player fundamentally.
Kevin Mitchell for him, right?
Yes, that's exactly right. He was a good player, and I think, underappreciated for some of the things that he did, because he played the game the right way. He was a good defender, good positional, good base runner, good situational hitter.
He was brought in to be the next face of the franchise.
He wasn't what we wanted.
That's the problem, is that you instantly know if a guy's brought in to be the face of a franchise, and the way the fans describe him as, he was a really good base runner. That's not a good sign for him.
And he would be the implacid face of a franchise, because he had like zero personality. Guy gave you nothing.
Which is what's great about today with Pete. Pete gives you personality.
Right. Oh, everybody gives you personality.
Yeah.
But we can get into that a whole nother time. I saw some video with some high school kid hit a home run in the game and all that stuff, and he's doing it all. The full posturing and all that stuff. And I think Jeffries, who follows Greg Jeffries, is like, man, if I did that, my coach would have kicked my ass if I got back to the bench.
Oh man, yeah, I couldn't have gotten away with
in
that.
high school.
I remember one time I pumped my fist after getting a strikeout coming off the field, and the pitching coach pulled me over. I was like, we don't do that here.
Yeah, so McReynolds was not one for celebrations, but the next guy, I came up with this as Cespedes as one of the top Met left fielders of all time.
Again, not a good sign for the Mets.
No, Bernard Gilkey. And really, these are good ball players.
Gilkey's actually...
he played well for the Mets.
Cespedes, I think, is not a good sign for the Mets, more just out of the sheer frustration that he brought Mets fans, because he was such a good player, except he was also just the most bizarre individual we've ever dealt with.
You could say that he at least, but he was responsible for them getting to the 2015 World Series.
100%. They do not make it without that trade.
Exactly, and even George Foster is on this list, and George Foster was a great ball player for the Cincinnati Reds. He was not a good player for the Mets. Let's just be nice guy. I like George. I've met George. Very friendly, very nice. Cleon Jones is on that list, which is kind of like a slap at Cleon Jones that you put him below George Foster.
Right.
So, and I'd even put McNeil. Has to.
He just doesn't play enough left.
He doesn't get to go anywhere because he plays all over the place.
Exactly.
Center field. I don't think there's any question who the greatest center fielder in Met history is.
It's Carlos Beltran.
It's Carlos Beltran. Yeah. I think
Beltran will probably go into the Hall of Fame as a Met. I think there's a pretty good shot at that.
I think you're right, and I think I'm going to say something. I think Beltran is a little underrated by guys my age as a player.
The same thing that kind of damned him as a player is now kind of damns him as after his career, in that he made it look so easy.
Perfect.
You forget how good he was.
Exactly. I think, who was it? Willie Randolph?
Yes, Willie Randolph.
Who was saying something about like, I don't really, doesn't look like Carlos is running fast out there, but I see the numbers going by him on the fence behind.
I know he's going
so
fast.
I know he's going fast.
Yeah. And that was the thing about Carlos, is that, the guy has a career 70 WAR. He had 430 homers in his career. He had a career 280 average. He was an unbelievable player.
I think he has the record for the highest percentage of stolen bases. You know, like he was successful on well over 80% of his stolen base attempts for his career. He ran, but he always made it.
And he won Rookie of the Year, finished high in the MVP voting, won some Gold Gloves with the Mets.
Would you say that after him, now you didn't see AG play, obviously, and all you do is hear about Tommy Agee. Well, Tommy Agee showed up when the Mets needed it the most, and he gets credit for that, and we should love him for that.
I think right now you would probably rank him above Nimmo, but I think there's a good chance Nimmo's going to pass him before the end of his career.
I would tend to think it's really close right now. I think Nimmo's overall contribution over a longer period of time, and Agee had played.
And
for
that's
the Mets.
Brandon Nimmo is probably the one player that if you're not a Mets fan, you do not realize how good Brandon Nimmo is.
Yeah, and I hope because of the long deal and all that he will retire a Met.
I think he will.
And I think if he retires a Met and he goes along this way, he's going to have his number retired.
He and Pete, Pete, and then McNeil would have to
develop
another component to his game.
Yeah, he'd have to go wild for 5 or 6 years, and he's already 31, so I don't know that that'll happen. And we talked about center fielders were sold. So Dykstra and Mookie Wilson, they were a tag team,
and they were an
in
integral
86,
part to that 86
team, and they were really good center fielders for the Mets. And so,
but just the inherent fact that you had to platoon them in that fashion, even if it was the right thing for the team, kind of speaks to both of their skill sets.
That's a good point, I think. But they were a great compliment to have.
No doubt. But if you gave 86, if you went back in time, you can have Mookie Wilson and Lenny Dykstra, or you can have Carlos Beltran.
Oh, no. We're not having this conversation.
We're not having this conversation.
You're not even getting it with Nimmo or Agee, if you're asking me. And that particular, so
it immediately makes both of those teams, that team, better.
Now, a guy you've heard of and you know his name and all that, Lee Mazzilli.
I know him more as a coach and a manager than as a player.
So I guess because I'm old, he was the upcoming young kid, who was the handsome kid from Brooklyn, and he had the New York accent, and he was just, everybody loved Lee Mazzilli, and he was a exciting rookie on a terrible team, just the worst team, and he had to sort of carry that whole franchise on his back as the face of the franchise when they were bad, and it wore on him, and it wore on the Met fans, and eventually he left, and never, he did have that moment in the All-Star game where I think he hit the game-winning single to win the All-Star, right? And on the national stage, and that probably was his best moment as a Met. I would say Met fans might disagree. In right field, I think it's pretty easy who the greatest right fielder would be.
It's not even close, I think.
Okay, I was wondering how you'd feel.
Strawberry is the best.
So Conforto you like, but not putting him there.
No.
Yeah, me neither.
And the problem is after Conforto, there's nobody.
No,
you're trying to tell me that Ron Swoboda.
I loved Ron Swoboda. I was such a fan, and he was my hero because he hit 19 home runs in like 1960, and I thought, wow, that's how bad the Mets were, by the way, because he hit 19 home runs, and I was so excited. We have this power hitter, and he was not a great ball player. Right. He batted like 240.
And I'm not saying that this is like I said, when you look at comparison, you would take both of the guys. You would take Conforto or Strawberry over him every single day of the week without hesitating.
And they called him Rocky, and I could never figure. I never understood because he didn't look like a Rocky. He didn't talk like a Rocky. He became a broadcaster,
like Sylvester Stallone.
I know, no, he doesn't not like
and
that
that's
at
like
all.
Years laughter.
But two different moments in his career sort of stand out to me. Ron Swoboda. Steve Carlton, we talked about him in our last podcast, strikes out 19 Mets. Ron Swoboda hits 2 two-run homers. The Mets win 4-2. Okay, so that's one, right? And the other was the catch. Game 4 of the 1969 World Series, Swoboda, who's not known as a lithe fielder, let's just leave it at that, okay, comes running in and a million times dives to the ball, full extension on his back end, and he catches the ball. In fact, he might have been the most surprised guy.
And then he caught the ball.
When he gets, he actually got up and he fired the ball in and went back there going, yeah, that was great. So that was the two of his best moments as man. He was a hero of mine, and you can have a hero who's not a great ball player when you're a little kid.
Exactly. Now,
because you don't know.
When we get to the fourth guy on the list for right field, it's probably the most known Mets right fielder outside of maybe Strawberry, and that's Bobby Bonilla.
Yeah.
Who actually had some decent seasons for the Mets, but he's not known for that.
No, and this all, look, I remember when it happened, right? So you weren't watching it happen. he just wasn't the player we Met fans wanted him to be. Just
Right.
pure and simple, and
Wasn't the contract we wanted it to be?
well, I think it was him who said it's going to take a lot to knock the smile off my face, is what Bonilla said when he signed the contract or something like that. Well, the Mets fans tried to knock the smile off his face.
they were not
because
happy.
Like, he was Bobby Bonilla for a long time, and
Bobby's still getting paid, Nia.
well, he's still getting paid, and Steve Phillips, who does the show on Sirius, the morning show.
Yeah.
He was saying that every year's Bobby Bonilla Day, he gets a card from Bobby Bonilla, and Bobby Bonilla's going to call into the show and thank Steve for the contract because he's still being paid $1 million a
Two
year.
more seasons until 2025.
That was signed in 1992 or something like that.
Now, the funny thing is, I think when you look at it adjusted for inflation, it's actually not that ridiculous of a contract. It's just the length of it. And there's actually a whole lot of other teams that are paying guys on these crazy deferred
you're right.
contracts.
Right.
But it's just funny because it's the Mets.
It's like the butt fumble.
Right.
It's got that same kind of thing. And so other right fielders, just to mention Jeremy Burnitz, you probably don't remember.
I do remember Burnitz. He was a Brewer before he was a Met.
No, the other way around.
He was a Met before he was a Brewer.
Right. So he came to the Mets, and he was supposed to be the next thing
Right.
out there. They had another guy we don't even talk about, Alex Escobar. He was one of those 5-tool players. Unfortunately, none of them were baseball tools, so it didn't work out so well for him. And Jay Bruce, which I like seeing his name in here. Jay Bruce tried really hard when he was on the Mets. It just didn't work out, and that was
He had one good season.
Yeah. And Sean Green, who I really liked as a Met.
Had one very good season.
Yeah.
But it was only he was there and gone.
I like that player. So how about the catcher pantheon?
Really strong top of the catcher pantheon. Not a lot of teams could boast to have 2 Hall of Fame catchers.
Right. You only saw one of those guys play. If you had to pick, can you evaluate the contributions of both of them? And Piazza didn't win a World Series.
Right. I think if you had to pick both of them at their best, you'd almost want to go Carter because he was so much of a better defensive catcher than Piazza, and he was still a very, very good offensive player. You lose a little bit of the offense because he didn't have the power Piazza had, but
he had 300 career home runs. But no, I mean, yeah,
he wasn't Piazza power,
but he wasn't. I think you're shortchanging his power.
Right. I'm just saying he wasn't the thing is, if you say that he's as good a power hitter,
I think he was nearly
Piazza doesn't have anything on him then.
Batting average, right? Piazza, those early years in Piazza's career, before he came to the Mets, even when he would bat 350 for the Dodgers, and things like that.
I remember as a high 300, like a 310 hitter, but not a 350.
He was a mid 300s hitter,
which is so ridiculous,
which is crazy for a catcher. But Carter, as you say, was such a better catcher, and he was a better teammate. Not that Piazza wasn't a good teammate, but Carter was the glue between he and Hernandez that made that team stay together.
The only thing I wonder is, does Carter's
Piazza didn't do that.
Does Carter's leadership style work if there isn't a Keith there? Or do they both need each other? In order to be good leaders?
I think it does. He was just such a rah guy. Probably people get sick of it. So there's going to be a few guys who just don't want to hear this guy's happy every darn moment. I'm tired of this, and that was kind of the rap on Carter. But I love Piazza, and I would also say that Piazza was not a great defensive catcher, but was not as bad as sometimes people make him out to be.
He had a better arm. No, was it his arm that was the problem?
He didn't have a great arm. Yeah. He called a good game. He blocked the ball okay, that kind of stuff. But yeah, just was not a guy to throw at anybody. And the recently departed John Stearns, who you probably know very little about, he was like the best player on the Mets for a few years back when they weren't very good. So consistently, just make the All-Star game. Jerry Grody, another hero. Travis d'Arnaud. God. Yeah.
LaDuca, Todd Hundley.
Yeah. Well,
Hundley, I remember, hit 40 homers.
LaDuca was a good player on a team. They needed him to have to have a catcher with experience. So, and then we get to the pitching, and
again, pretty good.
Yeah.
I think when you look at the absolute top end, but that's because when you have Seaver and 85 Doc.
Right, and throughout the Mets history, it's been pitching. Right, that was what drove the '69 team. It's what drove the '86 team in a lot of ways. I think
in essence, you could point to, if you look at the 3 most unhittable seasons that a pitcher has ever had, the Mets might have 2 of them: 85 Doc and 2021 DeGrom.
And then you're not even including Seaver in any of these.
No,
he just had 10 of them.
The other year I would give, because the other unhittable year a pitcher would have been Pedro's '99, because that might be the single greatest season a pitcher's ever had.
So
and then he went and came to the Mets.
Seaver by far, just due to longevity, due to consistency, due to being just one of the greatest pitchers in the history of baseball. Let's just say what it is.
And DeGrom would have probably joined him there had he not gotten consistently hurt the last few years.
Right, and we still hope that DeGrom somehow gets it together and pitches another 4 or 5 years of excellent baseball, so that he does go to the Hall of Fame and he wears the New York Met cap when he goes in.
To be in there because he is unquestionably, when he was on, the best pitcher in baseball, and it wasn't really close. That 2019 season where he started off that first half of the year, I never remember watching a guy and being like, the hitters on the other team just legitimately don't look like they have a chance to hit the ball. It was just that unfair.
Yeah, and it's just fun to watch him pitch. Just like the way for a short while it was fun to watch Matt Harvey pitch just before really DeGrom became what he is. Remember the whole Harvey Day thing? And
Harvey Day. You had we thought it was going to be Harvey, Syndergaard, and DeGrom.
But, DeGrom ended up being the lasting guy of those guys. And Doc Gooden, we all know the story there. But for those couple of seasons in '85 and in particular in '86, there was nobody more fun to watch or more exciting to go watch pitch. At that time.
Yeah.
Other guys on the all-time Met list, Koosman, Leiter. Well, I loved Al Leiter as a pitcher. I love Jerry Koosman as a pitcher.
So it's actually interesting because there's a guy, though here he is. He's down on this list, but he was somebody I came across because we were also looking for our most underrated Mets of all time. That's John Matlack.
Yeah. So Matlack, and you talked about that just before we went on air, and I said, to a Met fan that knows that John Matlack was one of the primary guys on the '73 team that went to the World Series.
This guy, 125, 126 career record, but he had a career 3.13 ERA. He had 40 career WAR. He was a good pitcher for the Mets. He just pitched for a bunch of lousy teams and then got shipped off.
Right, and he went to Texas, and nobody ever heard of him again.
The other thing is so I think the reason why a lot of Met fans my age don't know him is because he was traded the same year Seaver was traded. So I think that trade just gets lost in the shuffle.
That's a great point.
Because that the Mets shipped off 2 aces in effect that year instead of just 1.
And they were really terrible for the next 6 years.
Huh.
I wonder why that happened. So, those guys, and Pedro, even as a Met, even his short time as a Met, was excellent. And
Santana was good for them in his time. He got the only no-hitter for them, the only single-game no-hitter for them.
Another guy who has stats that are closer to the Hall of Fame, you might think, is David Cohn. Mm-hmm. And we don't think of him necessarily as a Met.
Same with Al Leiter.
Yeah. Well, I think Cohn is
closer than Leiter.
Closer than Leiter, I think. Saberhagen, too. Another guy who just didn't do it long enough.
You're right.
These guys are all in that same sort of,
that same almost land.
Yeah, almost land. You don't remember Big Sid Fernandez?
Yeah.
The Hawaiian sensation? Oh, Sid was big. And he was from Hawaii, so he wore number 50. 50th state and all that stuff. And Sid was hard to hit. And Sid's performance in the 1986 World Series when the starter got knocked out in the game and he came in and pitched like 5 scoreless innings, sort of stabilizing everything, allowing the Mets to come back. That's a signature moment for a guy who did whatever the team asked him to do. So he didn't necessarily always have a defined role as a starter his entire time as a Met. He was just a guy that you could put Sid in and he was going to strike you out. Guy had like 11 Ks per 9 innings.
So you just put in Sid, you're like, he's going to give us innings here.
And he had this peekaboo sort of motion because he's a big, guy, and he comes from he can't even see the ball, and all of a sudden it's up on you. So, I really, really think that's an underrated Met. Mm-hmm. I would put him on one of those. And I would say Bobby Ojeda he had that great 86 season, and then some weird stuff happened to Bobby Ojeda.
Speaking of underrated Mets, who would be your pick for an underrated Met? We kind of went into this thinking, all right, 200 games or more as a Met, because we didn't want to pick one guy that came in for one season, had a good season, and then left, because that just didn't feel fun. So who do you have? Because I have a guy, and I think he's probably not...
The same guy I have?
Probably not.
Well, aside from the guy we just mentioned, by the way, who I think, would be, Pedro could be a guy who played...
It's actually, my guy's actually closely connected to the guy we were talking about before Pedro and Sid Fernandez, and that's Benny Agbayani.
Oh, we loved Benny Agbayani. Another Hawaiian,
played 3 seasons for the Mets. He had 125, 122 OPS. Those years.
Wow, that's much better than I would expect.
You would have never thought he was that good a hitter for them, but he hit 289, 274, hit like 15 home runs.
It was hard to find a place for him to play on the field.
Because he was not a good fielder.
And there was no DH at the time.
I don't remember anybody talking, because everybody remembers him for that big home run he had.
So I'll give you a guy that
He gets the Giants.
People are going to give me a hard time on this because he had a better Met career than people think, and for whatever reason, I would say this about this player afterwards. He had some of the worst baseball instincts on the field of anybody I've ever seen, and yet I think he's underrated in his Met career, and that's Greg Jeffries.
Yeah,
and I hope Greg. We can get him on the podcast one day because we've had a couple of exchanges with him.
One of the more hard done by Met guys in a lot of ways because he got the expectations foisted upon him were unfair to kind of put on any one player.
Right. So you know the story. So in '88, he comes up 2/3 of the way through the season until August and has a ridiculous August into September, and the Mets win 100 games. They win the National League East, and
they fall to the Dodgers.
And they fall to the Dodgers in the playoffs. But this is like a really exciting ball player that the Mets have. And like they played him at second, they played him at third, they played him wherever they could at first and stuff like that. And while he was on the Mets, he just could never get it together for the reasons you described. That the fan base expected so much out of this guy, and he just.
The pressure was probably insane.
But you look at his career stats, his stats with the Mets were good, and he got better after he left the Mets.
Right. But Mets fans, they expected him to be an MVP from pretty much after that call up. Once he had that little showing, they're like, oh, okay, yeah, he's going to be an MVP candidate next year.
And he kind of had a look about him that he was in pain all the time from how hard he was trying and it wasn't working out. And somehow that didn't play well with the New York fan base, that he just kind of looked,
hangdog.
Yeah, whiny. I don't want to be negative on it, but just like you knew how much he cared, you knew how much he wanted to win, and he couldn't do it, and he couldn't rise above
rather than being endearing, the fan base didn't like him.
You're just not. You're not one of us. So I would say him. I don't know if Rusty's starved by Met fans. Everybody loves Rusty, but
right.
I think you would if you don't know the Mets, you might not know that.
And you also, as a Met fan, you might look at Rusty Staub and think of him more as like, oh yeah, he was Rusty. You don't realize how good he actually was.
And the guy that they traded also to the Reds, Steve Henderson, was a good Met who probably doesn't get his name mentioned too much. So it's nice to hear me to say Steve's name on the podcast because I thought he was a really good Met. So the team is the Mets just are always going to be a team that's trying to get on what used to be the back page of the papers, and it's tough to do that in the Yankee team. I think they're in a better position to do it now than they've been in a long time because they've got an owner willing to spend, and they're
not talked about
noise.
Like they're the little brother franchise.
I don't feel that way. I don't feel that way anymore. So I'm confident. My hopes for the team this year remain World Series or bust, and I'm looking more.
I want to watch playoff baseball again this year.
So, but all we can say is, let's go Mets.